And so we will begin. Welcome to session 3 of Judaism's Ancient and Ongoing Roots in Israel. I'm Kate Lukasiewicz, the Education Programs Director at Classrooms Without Borders. In order to cultivate a sense of community, we invite you to turn on your cameras and to remember that you will be muted during today's Zoom. We're grateful to host educators on this Zoom who are earning professional development credits for their learning. Consequently, the program may differ from what we usually experience with Avi, but he will still be expertly leading the content while he suggests instructional ideas for the educators. This offers a novel experience for our community of lay people to see firsthand the quality professional learning that CWB offers to its educators. For the educators among us, thank you for making time on a Sunday to join us and for all that you do for your students every day. If you are an educator certified in Pennsylvania, in a moment, I will drop into the chat a survey link that you can use to submit your PPID so that we can award your Act 48 hours. This program, like so many that Classrooms Without Borders offers, is free for the community. If you are so inclined, we would be grateful for any contributions that allow us to continue offering high quality events at no cost. I'll drop that link into the chat in a moment. The session on the Israel-Hamas War delves into October 7th, 2023, the coordinated attacks by paramilitary groups like Hamas and the Islamic Jihad movement in Israeli territory. It was the first invasion since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, occurring on Sukkot, becoming Israel's bloodiest day and the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Our scholar today is Avi Ben-Hur, a Brooklyn native who moved to Israel in 1983. Avi's expertise lies in the geopolitical issues underlying the Arab-Israeli conflict, interfaith encounters, world Jewish heritage, and Holocaust studies. As a scholar in residence for Classrooms Without Borders, Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the US, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, Spain, Italy, Austria, and Greece. If you have any questions for Avi during today's session, please feel free to message him directly via the chat function. Without further delay, I invite my dear friend and most excellent collaborator, Avi Ben-Hur, to share his expertise with us. Please join me in welcoming him to the program.
Thank you, Kate. So some of you will probably remember from last week, I told you I will not be broadcasting from Jerusalem. I'm actually here in Pittsburgh in the CWB offices here. So it's actually 1 o'clock in the afternoon, not just for you, but for me as well. Okay, as opposed to 8 o'clock in the evening, it usually is for me. That doesn't mean I'm bright eyed and bushy tailed, but I'm in the same time zone as you are. All right, so just to get everybody on the same page, same book, and I'm assuming, although I should not assume anything, that most of you, all of you, have been in the first two sessions. The first session, basically, I connected or showed the connection, the 3,000 years of a Jewish connection to the land of Israel. The second session, which was a week ago on Sunday, we tried to do kaleidoscopically the entire Arab-Israeli conflict, which was kind of tough to do in an hour. And today on the agenda is to deal specifically with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And here I think I need to say again why I made this distinction. And because in 1948, when you have what we call a war for independence, it had two halves. The first half was the Jewish and Arab communities of Palestine that were duking it out, okay, in the wake of the UN partition plan of November 29, 1947. The Jews won that, declared independence the following day. It was 6 months of fighting, declared independence the following day, the 14th of May, 1948. And within 24 hours, Israel was invaded by 5 Arab states. So it went from being an intercommunal or a civil war to an international war. And when the dust settled, from 1948 to 67, the Palestinians were really not on the agenda. They weren't there. I mean, they were physically there, but they weren't part of the conflict. It was the Arab-Israeli conflict, okay? And over time, some of the big players that fought with Israel for decades, like Egypt, like Jordan, actually signed peace accords with Israel, which have held till today. I should probably knock on wood when I say that, but they've held till today. Egypt being the first of the Arab countries to sign a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. Okay, so this is not to say that there are no Arab countries that are officially at war with Israel. They are. Syria is officially at war with Israel. It has been since 1948. That hasn't changed. Lebanon is officially at war with Israel since 1948. And the truth is, the Saudis, who also participated in the war in 48, are officially a state of war. And many the Arab countries never never created diplomatic relations with Israel. But that having been said, the truth is that up until our present malaise, we really, and even including to a certain extent, the idea that Israel would be fighting with an Arab country per se in the last 2 decades was something that was, I wouldn't say unthinkable, but it wasn't something that we were expecting. As you all know, Syria is off the table because Syria is a failed state, doesn't even control all the territory that's in Syria. And that would be the only option of a state that's contiguous with Israel. Lebanon is a different story because of Hezbollah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that at the very tail end over here because it relates to the present conflict as well. So the main focus today is going to be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I do want to introduce something into this session, which I didn't really speak so much about in the previous sessions, but I think it's important. There is an element in this conflict, in this national conflict, there is a religious element. And as I think I said last time, the beginning of the last session, there are plenty of national conflicts we're familiar with that have no religious element whatsoever, right? Russia, Ukraine right now, they're not different faiths. Okay, they're not. It's not a religious conflict per se. Yeah, the troubles in Ireland, yes, religious, if you will. Okay, when you look at former Yugoslavia, some of it was religious, some of it's not. But the bottom line is not every national conflict has a religious element, and this particular one didn't necessarily have to have one for one simple reason. The Jewish national movement, the Zionist movement, was a secular one, was and is a secular one, and didn't frame things in a religious discourse. And religion was not what was really driving the Zionist story, the Zionist narrative. And the Palestinian one is going to bring religion into the conflict rather early, and I'm going to talk about that here as well today. But I would make the argument that from 1948 until, let's say, I don't know, until even Oslo, until 1993, the religious element in the conflict was not a strong one or an acute one. It was present, but it wasn't the biggest issue. And what we found is, since the 1990s forward, the religious element, and here I have to say on both sides of this conflict, has taken a much more central position. And it definitely relates to where we're at right now since October 7th. So without further ado, let's jump in. What I've done for you here is I put kind of a timeline of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here. It's not a comprehensive, but it kind of gives us some signposts. So 1948, the Israeli War for Independence, and for the Palestinians, what they call a Nakba, a catastrophe. 1967, for 19 years, from 48 to 67, the Palestinian agenda was not on the agenda. It was on their agenda, but it wasn't on the world's agenda in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and certainly not for Israel. In the wake of the Six-Day War, we talked about this also, and we'll show it again in maps in a few moments. In the wake of the Six-Day War, Israel now has control of millions of Palestinians, and so the issue is going to come forward again. All right, and what we're going to find is between 1967 till today, Israel embarked on a settlement enterprise, which I'm going to talk about, which definitely impacts the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, and also impacts any potential peace agreement. From 1987 to 1991, the Palestinians waged their first uprising, which they called the first Intifada. Intifada, by the way, means shaking off. It means like shrugging off or shaking off, and the idea was to shake off, to shrug off Israeli control. That lasted from 87 to 91. Then we had the Oslo process, which went from 93 to 2000, to all intents and purposes. In the year 2000, and somehow this slipped off this timeline, even though I put it in the initial one, in the year 2000, you had Camp David. That was the tail end of the Oslo process, where we had a significant, serious attempt at a peace agreement, which collapsed. I'm going to talk about the various attempts to make peace as well. In the wake of that, you had the second Palestinian uprising, the second Intifada, which was an extremely violent one. It lasted for 5 years. It was devastating for both sides in terms of lives lost. And it's also very important in terms of understanding the conflict as continuation on both sides. 2005, very relevant to what we're talking about today. With Hamas in 2005, Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip lock, stock, and barrel unilaterally, but we left it in control of the Palestinian Authority. And within 2 years, Hamas actually deposed the Palestinian Authority. And from 2007 forward, Hamas has basically been running the Gaza Strip. And we had a series of 4 altercations, operations, up until the present one. We had one in 2008 between Israel and Hamas, another one in 2012, another one in 2014, and another one in 2021. And we have the present one, of course, which is the war. So let's just jump in together, with your permission. Just a quick reminder here. We're looking at, on the left-hand side, the map of Palestine, okay, that received the mandate from the League of Nations, or Britain received a mandate from the League of Nations to prepare the natives for self-determination. You look around, they also, Jordan, which they called then Transjordan, is also part of a British mandate. It's going to be prepared for for independence. And you see it in the northern part, both Lebanon and Syria were a French mandate. Okay, this is the situation in 1923. Okay, the mandate actually it's really nailed down officially in San Remo in 1920, but 22, 23, the boundaries, the physical borders or boundaries between the British mandate and the French mandates, and between the British mandate in Jordan and in Palestine, are going to be delineated properly. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181 of the 29th of November, 1947. I want to tarry here for a moment because I want to say the following. There's 3 words that all of you are very familiar with, which are on a lot of lips of a lot of players today for a very long time. And those 3 words are two-state solution. Now, what you see in front of you here is actually the second proposal of a two-state solution. I mean, on the right-hand side here, because actually the first one took place in 1937. The British created something called the Peel Commission, and they decided they proposed to partition Palestine in 1937. That's 10 years, a decade before the UN partition plan. The British were going to partition it. It's not the same map. I mean, it's not the same partition in terms of who was given what. For example, the British were going to hold on to the port in Haifa and Jerusalem and other parts. And the Jewish state would have been much, much smaller than what was proposed here. But in any event, this Peel partition plan of 1937 was rejected entirely by the Palestinians. The Jews, Zionist leadership, basically we don't like the plan it looks like, but we'll think about it. They didn't reject it in its entirety, okay? But what I'm trying to tell you is the idea of a two-state solution was already out there in 1937, which means, ladies and gentlemen, that the two-state solution as a solution has been out there for, what, 85, 90 years. It's been around for quite a long time, almost 90 years, okay, something like that, which is interesting. And it still is not flying, but I want you to be aware of that. Now, what you're going to see next, of course, is the following. If you go back to the map for a second and look to the right-hand side, you see in yellow here, you're looking at Jerusalem. And actually, Jerusalem's not that big on the map. And I'll explain why there's a big yellow blot over here. Essentially, the UN understood that Jerusalem was going to be a tough nut to crack because both the Jewish national movement, the Zionist, and the Arab national movement, the Palestinian national movement, wanted Jerusalem to be the capital of their state. Now, mind you, Palestinians didn't accept the partition plan, but I'm a little ahead of myself here. When the UN is putting together this plan, they decide to remove Jerusalem from the table. Now, it's a bit tricky because we go back to our map. Again, I'm sorry to do this up and back view. On the right-hand side, we can ask ourselves a question. It's a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer the question. Okay, you see here in blue, dark blue is supposed to be the Jewish state, and this lightish green is supposed to be the Palestinian Arab state. And the question is, what are the criteria to determine who gets what? So essentially, the main criterion to determine who would get what is demographics. In other words, in 1947, most of what the Jews got for their state was where most of the Jews were. Okay, much of what the Arabs got for their state was where most of the Arabs were. FYI, if this plan had actually come to fruition. Actually, it happened, and a Jewish state would have been established next to a Palestinian Arab state. The Jewish state in 1947 or 48, before the war, would have been something like 600,000 Jews and 450,000 Arabs in that Jewish state. So we're not talking here that this partition plan was transferring populations. It wasn't swapping populations. It was taking the situation on the ground, okay, and drawing lines on it. It's not the story of Turkey and Greece in 1922-23 of forcibly expelling the Muslim or Christian populations. That's not the story here. It's not supposed to be a population transfer in this plan. Now, why am I saying that? Because if the main criterion to determine who gets what is demographics, we should raise the question, what was the situation in Jerusalem? Now, if you recall in our last session, I believe I said, I'm quite sure I said to you that when the war breaks out, there are about 600,000 Jews and a little less than 1.3 million Palestinian Arabs, meaning the Arabs were twice the number, right? Intuitively, if I ask you, what about Jerusalem? I'm not going to ask you because I can't get your response. Okay, so I'll respond to myself. Were there more Jews and more Arabs in Jerusalem? I think many of you can be surprised to hear that we take a look at the snapshot of Jerusalem in 1947, in November 47, when the UN is rolling out their plan. There are 100,000 Jewish residents and 65,000 Arab residents. In fact, the Jewish population of Jerusalem became a majority starting from 1872 forwards. And that's important because that's a decade before the first Zionist stepped foot in this country. There already was, the Jews hit 50% of the population in 1872 of Jerusalem. When you get now to 1947, the Jews are 100,000 and the Arabs are 65,000, but the UN's got a solution to this. Okay, what they're basically going to do is they are going to gerrymander. That's an American term. They're going to expand the municipal lines. See, this was Jerusalem, what you see in the middle here with my cursor. This is Jerusalem under the British mandate. Okay, the UN is going to expand dramatically. Okay, the lines of Jerusalem, the municipal boundaries. They're going to rename it as Corpus Separatum, which is Latin for a separate legal entity. And by doing so, let's go back again. You're now going to have 102,000 Jews, 105,000 Arabs. Even Stephen, nobody gets it. The UN internationalized the city, which is what you see back over here. This yellow blotch here is the city supposed to be internationalized. So the UN recognized that this is going to be a tough nut to crack. So anyway, and we'll explain why in a moment. Moving forward here, okay, what's going to happen on the ground since the Palestinians reject the partition plan and they initiate a war within 24 hours. We know the war breaks out. We talked about that in December 1948. And at this point, by the way, the war is not completely over, but Israel and Jordan are no longer fighting. And to all intents and purposes, each one controls a different part of the city. On the 5th of December 1948, Israel is going to annex West Jerusalem. And within a week, they're going to declare it as the capital of the state. On the 13th of December, Jordan's going to annex their respective part of the city of Jerusalem, which includes the old city, and make it their second capital. So Jordan, for 19 years, had two capitals. The main capital is Amman, which you're familiar with, but Jerusalem was their secondary capital. Okay, that's the story of Jerusalem. And what you're seeing here, if you look at the map that I just put up here, okay, just to give you a sense of the proportions, okay, I'm going to trace now with my cursor what Jerusalem, okay, looked like for 19 years in terms of its municipal lines, okay? West Jerusalem, which I'm tracing over here, which basically was under Israeli control, it was the capital state of Israel over here, constituted about 22 square miles. I see it, 38 square kilometers. And East Jerusalem under Jordan, I'm tracing it now with my cursor as well, this area here basically constituted 6 square kilometers, or about 3.8 miles, something like that. So Israeli Jerusalem, West Jerusalem was much, much larger than Jordanian East Jerusalem. And this is for 19 years, from 1948 to 1967. Okay, lo and behold, when I want to take a look now at the armistice lines, when the war's over, okay, basically the state of Israel that emerges in 1949 is slightly larger than what had been allotted to the Jews, okay, by the partition plan of the 29th of November 1947. Having said that, we take a look here, I'm tracing right here where it says Hebron and Nablus and Jenin. This is the West Bank. And this was captured by Jordan, not from Israel because we weren't there. Okay. And instead of creating a Palestinian state, they annexed this in 1950 to Jordan, and it became part of Jordan. This piece in yellow over here, which is the Gaza Strip, was conquered by Egypt, not from Israel. We weren't there. The Egyptians were basically heading up to Tel Aviv, and we stopped them around over here where my cursor is. Okay, about 25 miles south of Tel Aviv. We stopped the main Egyptian thrust. But when we pushed the Egyptians out, they stayed here in the Gaza Strip. They didn't create a Palestinian state or give them autonomy. You had a military occupation here for 19 years under the Egyptians. So let me just summarize what I said right now. Okay, Israel wins the war, Israel's established and survives the war. But the Palestinians, essentially, are being controlled at this moment, the overwhelming majority of them, those that remain, either by Jordan, and they become Jordanian citizens, or by Egypt, and they don't become Egyptian citizens because Egypt has a military occupation there. Within the state of Israel, they're going to be about 155,000 Arabs who become full citizens of the state of Israel, and they constitute at the time about 18% of the citizens of Israel at the time. And of course, we have the refugees, and we referenced them last week, and it's important because in the context of the Gaza Strip, if you take a look over here at this map, the Gaza Strip, you had about 190,000 refugees are going to flee to the Gaza Strip. Okay, the largest number of refugees will flee to the West Bank, into the Jordanian territory. But after that, the second largest is going to be in the Gaza Strip. So let me give you the bottom line. Something like 50% of the Gazans are defined today, are defined as refugees. Remember, we talked about how the refugee status is passed down generationally, about 50%. And by the way, when they flee to the Gaza Strip in 1948, 1949, there's no strip. Is the town of Gaza. Okay, the Gaza Strip is a creation of the war in 48. Okay, it's a strip of land that's going to be militarily occupied by the Egyptians, and essentially you're going to have this refugee population that's going to become the residents there. You didn't have a lot of Arabs living there. Okay, you didn't have really cities or towns or anything like that. That will develop over time. Okay, now again, showing a map we saw last week. This is all of Israel's, if you will, acquisitions in 1967. In the wake of the Six-Day War, Israel will capture the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. As part of our peace treaty with Egypt, we're going to give back the Egyptians the Sinai Peninsula. We offered them the Gaza Strip. They said no. We have actually annexed the Golan Heights in 1981, and the West Bank we never annexed. Okay, this is important. I want to now jump back to something I started with, which is the religious element of the conflict. And this is particularly regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it also relates to the Arab-Israeli conflict to a certain extent. We should not forget that Jerusalem contains within it the holiest sites to the Jewish faith, historically, and also the third holiest site to the Islamic faith after Mecca, Medina. The issue is it's the same site. And this site is not a shared site. It is a contested site. You're seeing it in its present configuration right now in front of you with the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I think many of you have been up there or have seen it up close. These structures were constructed, Dome of the Rock in 691 CE or AD, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 715 CE or AD, by Muslims who conquered, Arab forces that conquered Jerusalem for the first time, at the beginning of the 7th century. But 2,000 years ago, where the Dome of the Rock is located is where Herod the Great's temple stood. And if you're Christian and participating here, that was the temple that Jesus interacted with. And 3,000 years ago, where the Dome of the Rock is, it wasn't Herod's temple, he wasn't born yet, but it was King Solomon's temple from Old Testament Hebrew Bible fame. Okay, you can also see in the corner here the Western Wall. So this gets complicated. You see the Western Wall, and you see above the Dome of the Rock and the Western Wall laid out below it. Okay, let me restate this because we have to make this very, very clear because a lot of Jews don't understand this. The holiest site of the Jewish faith is not, I repeat, not the Western Wall. The holiest site of Jewish faith is the Temple Mount where the temple stood, and specifically where you see the Dome of the Rock because that's where the temple Jewish temples, okay, first and second, stood, whether it's Solomon's temple or Herod's temple. The Western Wall is merely a retaining wall, a wall that supports the platform on which the temple stood. Okay, in place of, instead of the Jewish temple that was destroyed by the Romans, not by the Arabs, but by the Romans in 70 CE or AD. Okay, you had the construction of the Dome of the Rock in 691 by Muslims, and it's about the Herod's temple is 2.5 times the size of this not so small structure. But in either case, this complicates things dramatically. And when I said to you that the Palestinians deliberately introduced the religious element into the conflict in 1929, so you didn't have this large prayer space in front, prayer plaza in front of the Western Wall. You had a narrow alleyway with structures built almost up against the wall. You had something like it was 3 yards deep and maybe 15 yards wide. And up until 1929, there was no partition to separate men and women in prayer, which is the norm in Orthodox Judaism. I have to stop and say the following. First of all, today, the Western Wall Prayer Plaza operates as an open air Orthodox synagogue where there is separation by gender between men and women. Okay. I also have to say, those of you who are participating who are Jewish, but you're not Orthodox, so other denominations or streams of Judaism didn't really make it in the Middle East at large or in Israel in particular, including pre-State of Israel, the British Mandate. Let me say that more clearly. The Reform movement, the conservative movement, and other, certainly not Boo Jews and stuff like that, but Reconstruction, all later iterations, let's say Reform and conservative Judaism didn't really make any significant inroads anywhere in the Middle East, including, I'm talking about under the Ottoman Empire, when they emerged historically in Europe. Okay, they emerged historically, Reform and conservative Judaism reform. They both emerged in Germany and then crossed the Atlantic to the United States. Okay, and some to a certain extent to the UK. They didn't actually get any inroads in the Ottoman Empire. They didn't let them, the Ottoman Turks, and not into the British. So same thing in the modern state of Israel. Getting back to the story, 1929. Okay, the prayer that you're going to have here is going to be Orthodox prayer, and there was no partition between men and women because of the small space. In 1929, for the first time, the Jews introduced a partition, and the Palestinian Arabs used it as a cause célèbre to start a massive attacks on Jews, claiming that by putting a piece of wood on the floor to separate men and women, the Jews are trying to take over the entire Haram Sharif, noble sanctuary. Okay, and this is the first time we have the introduction of a religious conflict as an element in the national conflict here, and it's only been getting worse since. It was dormant and quiet between 1948 1967 because that's when Jordan ruled it, and the Jordanians, Hashemites, okay, who see themselves as direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, they put their patronage over the third holy site to Islam, very important to them. Okay, it'll reemerge after 1967 as a point of friction. Okay, and what you can see here, just so you see 2 photos here of the massive numbers of Muslims who pray during Ramadan. The last Friday in Ramadan is the holiest day in the Muslim calendar, and I can tell you that I think back in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, excuse me, the Israeli Internal Security Service counted upwards of 300,000 Muslims praying up there. Okay, that's a huge amount of people. Okay, praying at once. Okay, and you get this a sense, but let's not forget, here we have prayers on Shavuot. Okay, if you want an English, Pentecost, and also massive people praying at the base of it. It appears as though there's no problem. They're up there, we're down here, but it's actually more complicated than that. Okay, but I just want to say that the religious element was introduced deliberately by the Palestinians, and we have to keep in mind when we talk about Hamas, Hamas is an Islamic fundamentalist movement that perceives the entire land of Israel, or in their words, Palestine, as theologically as Muslim land. Okay, in Islamic theology, any land that was conquered or controlled by Muslim forces belongs to the world of Islam forever. Okay, and therefore, from a theological perspective, Hamas perceives all of Israel as Islamic land. Okay, and that's very important. So the religious element in the present conflict is very, very acute. It's very, very present. It really is. Which, by the way, not so much with the PLO beforehand. So I just want to emphasize that. even though most of the members of the PLO, not all, were Muslims, there were some Christians there as well, but they didn't frame the conflict with the Zionists, with Israel, in a religious framing. Hamas frames it specifically and deliberately in a religious framing, as does Hezbollah, by the way, which is Shiite, not Sunni. Okay, so after 1967, very important, very acute and sensitive point. And I'm going to do this short to the point. I have a whole hour and a half lecture just on this, but I have 60 seconds on this because we have a lot on our plates and the clock is ticking. So, in the wake of the Six-Day War, the then Israeli government, which is a center-left labor government, embarks on the establishment of Israeli Jewish communities in the recently acquired territory of the Six-Day War. That includes Sinai, that includes the Gaza Strip, that includes East Jerusalem, that includes the West Bank / Judea and Samaria, and includes the Golan Heights. Actually, just to be accurate, the first Israeli Jewish community or settlement that was established in the Golan Heights of all the territories. Now, we're not going to talk about the Golan because it's not relevant to our story with the Palestinians. We're not going to talk about the Sinai because we gave it back to Egypt and we uprooted all of these settlements there. We're not going to talk about East Jerusalem because in of itself, it's a different framework. I will mention a little bit, but I want to focus more on this. And the Gaza Strip in 2005, we pulled up the settlements lock, stock, and barrel. Okay. What I think is important to notice here, okay, are the following two things. Number one, today in 2024, we have about 500,000, 500,000 Israeli Jews living in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. I'm using these terms alternatively because I'm not trying to make any kind of political statement. Judea and Samaria is the biblical terminology and the one that's used today by the state of Israel. The West Bank is the political terminology used by just about the rest of the world. So I want all of us to understand what territory we're talking about, which you're seeing in front of you on both these maps. So there are 500,000 Jews living in this area, okay, in the West Bank. That's number one. That does not include East Jerusalem at all. Number two, the Palestinians from day one have perceived this, and most of the world as well, has perceived this as something that undermines any kind of peace settlement with Israel, particularly when we start to talk about attempts to make peace. In other words, once the Palestinians officially get on board with the idea of a two-state solution, okay, their claim is going to be that the establishment of Israeli settlements and the expansion of settlements undermines a two-state solution, because why would Israel spend billions of dollars US to build up communities in an area that they're going to give back to us as our state? Okay, and there's a certain logic to that thinking. It has to be said, and I want to finish up with this subject right now because we have way too many things to talk about. Okay, I have to say that the United States, from 1967 until about 1974, 75, okay, basically the U.S. policy towards the Israeli communities built in these areas was that it's not helpful to peace. For the first time, I think in 1975, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, for the first time, called the Israeli settlements illegal. Okay, and that was under President Ford. Under President Reagan, U.S. policy went back to being that it's not helpful for peace, but it's not necessarily, but didn't call it illegal per se. The first and only time the United States said, we don't think these settlements are illegal, was under the Trump administration, where Pompeo said, and I think he said it, if I'm not mistaken, I think he said in 2019, either 2018 or 2019, he said these are not illegal. And I don't think the Biden administration has actually weighed in specifically on that issue per se. But the bottom line is that this is considered one of the big stickling points in terms of trying to make peace. Okay, so we take a look at Jerusalem itself here, and I just want to show you something interesting. I'm going to trace now with my cursor what Jerusalem was until 67. We said that this area, you're looking at over here, this area that I'm tracing, this area was West Jerusalem, Israeli West Jerusalem, and this, one second, and this really, really small area over here was Jordanian Jerusalem. In 1967, Israel actually expanded 2.5 times the admissible boundaries of Jerusalem. So I'm tracing with my cursor over here. I'm showing you, okay, Jerusalem as we expanded it. Israel expanded it after 1967. And so if I told you that West Jerusalem was about 38 square kilometers and East Jerusalem under Jordan was 6 square kilometers, which comes to 44, we expanded to 126 square kilometers as compared to 44. 126 square kilometers is like something like 88 square miles, something like that. So we doubled and a half the area, and we began to construct all these blue blotches you see over here, Israeli neighborhoods and communities in areas that had previously been under Jordanian control. And this also relates to the conflict. But I want to move forward. 1987, first Palestinian uprising breaks out, and by the way, it breaks out in the Gaza Strip. And it's interesting because it breaks out. It's a spontaneous combustion, and we don't have time to talk about it, but I'll just say very briefly that it was mostly consisting of Palestinians, kids and adults who were burning tires in the middle of the roads, throwing rocks at soldiers and also at private vehicles and at people, and here and there also throwing Molotov cocktails. So it was civil disobedience. There was, like, rocks can kill, right? But throwing rocks is not the same as shooting, okay, or blowing yourself up. And of course, Molotov cocktails is very violent. But generally speaking, you didn't have huge numbers of Israeli citizens being killed. And it was basically civil disobedience. Israel didn't really know how to deal with it. And take a look. For the first time, Israel was framed internationally as the Goliath, and the Palestinians were David. And this is a flipping of the traditional narrative. This is going to last. It's going to peter out after about 4 years. And in 1993, we wake up to something known as the Oslo process. Okay. And here I just want to stop and show you a very, very brief timeline. It's actually not that brief, but I'll show you a timeline of attempts made for peace. And here, all the attempts here were mediated by the United States, and they all failed. So the first one that we're all familiar with were the Oslo Accords, and as part of the Oslo Accords, Israel together with the PLO, they recognized each other, and Israel together with the PLO created something known as the Palestinian Authority, and Israel over time pulled out of the main large concentrations of Palestinian civilians, meaning the cities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and handed over control to the Palestinian Authority. And let's say by 1996, more or less, the Palestinian Authority controlled 95% of the Palestinian population, but Israel controlled 60% of the territory. Okay, so the PA actually controlled about 40% of the territory. And this is part of the Oslo Accords. Israel did not build new settlements in this period of time, but between 1992 and 2000, the number of Israeli Israelis living in the West Bank had doubled in less than a decade through natural expansion, very high birth rate. 2000, we had the Camp David summit. President Clinton was the twilight of his presidency. Ehud Barak was the prime minister of Israel. Yasser Arafat was the head of the PA, and the talks failed. Talks failed over a whole slew of issues, but the primary issues from Israeli perspective were questions of sovereignty over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, okay, and a Palestinian demand of a right of refugees to return to Israel proper. In the wake of that, within about a month and a half, you had the second Palestinian Intifada uprising break out, very, very violent. But we continued to negotiate, and under Ehud Barak, who essentially is going to lose the election to Ariel Sharon, you're going to have the Taba negotiations where the two sides actually made progress, inching towards each other, but again, couldn't cut the deal, despite the fact that, again, Clinton tried very hard to make it happen. The following year, the so-called Arab Peace Initiative, is really a Saudi Arabian one, basically declared that if Israel withdrew from the entire West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, and a Palestinian state was established, then the entire Arab world would make peace with Israel. Okay, that was a big deal in terms of the statement at the time. Keep in mind, we still don't have normalization with the Saudis till today, and it's on the agenda. So this is something very interesting. 2008 is when we probably got closest to cutting a deal. Ehud Olmert was the prime minister. We now know he was at the twilight of his premiership because he had to step down the following year to go to court for corruption. He ended up going to jail. But Ehud Olmert actually came closest in terms of concessions to what the Palestinians had been demanding. He very, very close. And he never got a response from the Palestinians. And so it didn't happen. You had a lot of shuttling back and forth by Kerry under the Obama administrations, and the last time we've actually had any kind of negotiations of peace with the Palestinians was 2014. So it's been about a decade since we've had peace talks between Israelis and the Palestinians. In 2020, President Trump outlined his so-called deal of the century. Israel was fairly happy about it. Let's say it's some Israelis, or many Israelis. Palestinians were not, and they rejected it out of hand. Not all Israelis accepted it, even though it was giving Israel almost everything Israel wanted. But the Palestinians rejected that out of hand as well. Same year, you had the Abraham Accords, which were made between Israel and several Arab countries, totally normalized. And this also undermined. It basically said to the Palestinians, "You're not making peace. The Arab states can still make peace with us without that." And now we have the newly minted, literally for the last 48 hours, if you will, the so-called Biden Doctrine, which we're going to hopefully talk about as well if we have the time. Let's get to it. So Oslo process we talked about, and what were the big issues then? Okay, let's say from then until 2014. So I've kind of mapped out 6 of the primary issues. Security. This is basically an Israeli concern. If there's going to be a Palestinian state established, on our doorstep, how do we create and maintain security? Now, maybe in 1993, and then as we went through this process, maybe the U.S. or maybe the Palestinians were raising an eyebrow. Israel was a stronger party. Why is Israel so concerned about security? I think now, where we're sitting now after October 7th, Israel's demand for security guarantees have shown to be quite acute, but this is something very, very important. Okay, the other issue of borders. Okay, really the question there is, if there's going to be a two-state solution, what exactly are the what are the contours of the Palestinian state, and how much control they're going to have of the border? So, for example, Israel said, we want to see a demilitarized Palestinian state. We don't want to see a Palestinian state that's going to militarize itself, or that Iraq can come in, and cross over through Jordan and enter. What are the borders? Who controls the borders? What does that look like? What are the contours? The question of the settlements, and here there was a formula that was created and accepted on both sides of land swaps and annexation. Jerusalem, very hot topic. As I mentioned, 2000, this is one of the things that deep-sixed the attempted agreement because of this question of sovereignty over the acute holy sites there and the old city. So this is a big issue till today. And because both sides wanted it as their capital. Water issues, they may sound strange to you, but water is a very scarce commodity in these parts. The truth is that Israel essentially, moving forward from about the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, Israel's basically solved its water supply issues, because we massively desalinate. We're at a point now where something like close to 40% of all of water consumption, all of it, is desalinated water, and we don't have water shortage in Israel. That's not true of our neighbors, not true of the Palestinians, not true of the Jordanians, who have acute, or Syrians who have acute water scarcity. And of course, this question of the refugees, which is kind of a red herring for Israel, this idea that millions of Palestinians would enter Israel proper. And that was like a non-starter. So these are the outstanding issues on all of the negotiations that we referenced earlier. And here you get to see some of the what the contours that were presented, and I want to just shift forward just because of lack of time, but you get a sense here. One of the big issues that's always been on the table, and it definitely speaks to October 7th, when we take a look over here, there's no territorial contiguity between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the question is, how do you have a two-state solution when the Palestinians are geographically separated from each other, right? Gazans are Palestinians. So how does this work exactly? Okay, and keeping in mind, when you look at, you have the 2000 Camp David and 2000 Otaba, Israel's still in the Gaza Strip. This is not, this is before our disengagement of the Gaza Strip in 2005. That's very important to understand. But you see this red line, the idea was a so-called safe passage, that there would be some kind of artificial territorial contiguity that would be created that would connect the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, tunnels and roads and bridges and stuff like that, not actual territory, okay, but passage, safe passage. Here you can see the Annapolis proposal of 2008, and of course, the problem here is that Hamas already controls the Gaza Strip, not the PA. So is this practicable back then? Don't know, because they decided not to answer. They never responded to Ulmer. They meaning the Palestinian Authority. And then you have the so-called Trump Vision for Peace 2020. Again, what's in green here is supposed to be this kind of emergent state of Palestine, and it's kind of a Swiss cheese thing here, and something that was totally unacceptable to Palestinians. You notice over here, it's this gray area. This is the Jordan River Valley, and this is, from a strategic perspective, very important for Israel to control. So when I talk about boundaries, okay, here the Trump administration is giving Israel what it wants: continued control over this eastern flank. Okay, so to all intents and purposes, this so-called state of Palestine would have been actually surrounded by Israel from every direction. But again, the Palestinians wouldn't even look at this vision for peace, wouldn't even discuss it and negotiate it. Okay, now one has to understand that there were voices in Israel from day one, meaning from 1993 with Oslo forward, that were opposed to these agreements. I'll put it in different terms. Were opposed to a two-state solution. Let me just say that a third time now, and I'll say it very, very clearly. You have Israelis on the right flank of the right wing, and also in the religious right, that are opposed to any Palestinian state next to the state of Israel. They're opposed to a two-state solution. Okay, and we take a look at the Oslo Accords, the Israeli Jewish population, and I'm making a distinction between the Israeli Jewish population and the Israeli Arab population. The Israeli Jewish population in the 1990s, during the Oslo process, was split almost 50-50. There was slightly more, it was like 50 point something percent that were for the Oslo Accords, and there was like 49 point something percent that was opposed among the Israeli Jews. But all the Israeli Arabs, who constitute 20% of the population at the time, were for it. So you actually had a majority. It's democracy, right? You have to take the non-Jewish voices totally into account as well. But in terms of the Jewish majority, it was almost evenly split over this issue. Okay. And today, I'm going to go to the end of the story just for 30 seconds, folks. You have something like less than 30% of Israeli Jews who are for a two-state solution. I think it's like 27%. Okay. In polls from last week. Okay, so the two-state solution is definitely unpopular in Israel, and you have similar percentages on the Palestinian side. Okay, and of course, what's going to happen as part of this process is the prime minister who is on the Israeli side of this, who's promoting it, is going to be assassinated in November of 1995, and that is Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Okay, this is blood on the page of the song over here. And in 2000, again, new Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, meets Yasser Arafat with Clinton in Camp David, and this doesn't work. Right after that, or actually a few weeks later, Ariel Sharon, who was the head of the political opposition in Israel, is going to go up to the Temple Mount. He's going to ascend to the top of the Temple Mount, which he's allowed to do. He went with an entourage of like another 12 members of parliament from his party and like 1,000 cops. And basically, in a very, very short speech, said, "This is ours forever," and he goes back down. And the following day, the very, very violent Second Intifada broke out. Now, it appears there's a causal relationship, cause and effect. He goes up, following day, it breaks out. But the truth is, it was an internal discourse. He basically was saying to the Israeli uh, electors, the other guy, the prime minister, will give this up. If I'm elected prime minister, I will never give this up. And in fact, he won the election. But be that as it may, it appears that the Palestinian uprising was a planned one. It wasn't spontaneous. In contrast to the first Intifada, which is unequivocally spontaneous, this one was not. It was planned. And a lot of you remember this, it consisted of suicide bombers getting on public transportation, on buses, cafes, restaurants, cinemas, my local supermarket, you name it. And this went from 2000 to 2005. And over the course of this time, you had around 1,000 Israelis killed, okay, due to the terror attacks. And about 4,000 Palestinians died, by the way, as well, as part of the Israeli response. But this is 5 years. It was tough. Part of what's going to happen here is that Israel is going to build the so-called security fence, a security barrier, okay, in order to prevent the suicide bombers from getting in to Israel. And if you take a look at this chart over here, which is a little bit blurry, but it gives you kind of a trajectory of how this played out. It peaks in 2002, okay, where 220 people are killed due to terror attacks out of 55 successful attacks. 220 people are dead. And 2002 is when Israel begins to build the barrier. So you notice that within a year of starting to construct the barrier, the numbers of successful bombings is halved from 55 to 25, and we're having less people dying. 2 years into building the barrier, you're now down to a quarter of the people dying, okay, and about a quarter, less than a quarter of the attacks, or about a quarter of the attacks, and basically it peters out by 2006. It's basically over. So the barrier was definitely part of that story. It's time to talk a little bit about specifically the Gaza Strip. And essentially, to remind you, in 2005, Israel decides under Ariel Sharon to pull up lock, stock, and barrel from the Gaza Strip, including pulling out the entire military and pulling up every last settlement. It was done unilaterally, but we basically left the keys with the Palestinian Authority and said to them, our hands are extended in peace. You're on your own for the first time in your lives. Let's see what you can do. If you we're extending an olive branch, you grab it with 2 hands, we'll help make you the Singapore of the Middle East. Within 3 days, they began to shoot rockets. Okay, not them, Hamas, but from the Gaza Strip into Israel proper. Okay, and as I mentioned before, Hamas takes over militarily by violence in 2007. If you take a look at what you have in front of you, this is giving you the basic data of the Gaza Strip on the eve of the atrocities of October 7th. And I put this up because I want you to get a sense of what we're looking at over here. So half the people under the age of 18, half defined as refugees. Okay, all the energy sources are being supplied from the outside. Israel was supplying on October 6th something like 35 to 40% of the electricity for the Gaza Strip. Water sources, their natural water there. The water table has totally become salinated. They have some desalination plants. They have a problem with sewage disposal there. All their food is imported. Okay, they have zero natural resource. In other words, we look at this tiny strip of land, right? 139 square miles with 2.3 million people. You're basically looking at one of the most densely populated pieces of real estate on Earth, which, if peace were to break out, if peace had broken out on October 6th, also couldn't survive. It doesn't have the carrying capacity. It doesn't have the basic water, energy, and food resources to survive. It would have to be artificially resuscitated or artificially built up in order for it to flourish, and it's not. And essentially, once Hamas takes over in 2007, and it's important, look at the map on the right, you notice that Israel is surrounding over here, but in the left-hand corner here, it's Egypt that borders on the Gaza Strip as well. Okay, and essentially, when Hamas takes over, Israel and Egypt are going to apply kind of a blockade to prevent Hamas from getting their hands on weaponry, which obviously didn't work very well. Okay, but Egypt is part of the story here as well. Okay, here you can see the disengagement plant where we pull out of the Gaza Strip. And I think it's important for us to say just maybe a word or two about what Hamas is and what it's actually about. And we shouldn't get confused here. Hamas's foundational charter, okay, 1988, they basically framed themselves as an Islamic fundamentalist movement whose purpose is to turn Palestine into an Islamic guided state. Okay, they need to destroy Israel entirely. And in this context, it definitely meets the standard or the definition of genocide. So I'll say it again. Hamas is a genocidal movement based on their ideology and in terms of how they perceive what they need to do vis-a-vis Israel. That's very, very important for us to understand. And it certainly played out on October 7th. Now, something that is a little bit confusing, so I will try to demystify it literally in 30 seconds. Iran, as you know, is a Shiite state, and Hezbollah are Lebanese Shiites, and they are a proxy of Iran. Hamas are Sunni, they're not Shiite, and there is inherent and historic tension and animosity between Sunnis and Shiites, period. In other words, the marriage between Iran and Hamas is not a natural one. It's more one of convenience. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, meaning the Iranians are happy to have yet another proxy, even if they're Sunni Muslims and not Shiites. And Hamas needed the support of Iran. So on the one hand, Hamas is unlike Hezbollah, where when Iran says jump, Hezbollah says how high. It doesn't work that way with Hamas. Iran has supplied both knowledge and weaponry and training to Hamas. Iran has supplied it, but it's not the same kind of relationship as Hezbollah has. Okay, not in terms of the quality and quantity of weaponry and training, but also in terms of how loyal, let's say, Hamas would necessarily be to Iran. But there's definitely a piece of this which is as a proxy as well. Mention the fact there were 4 conflicts between Hamas and Israel, and basically between 2007 and this last year. Essentially, with each conflict, Hamas got more sophisticated in terms of their offensive tactics. They were basically shooting missiles or fairly unsophisticated projectiles and missiles in 2008, 2009. In 2012, Israel had already developed Iron Dome. Okay, and therefore we were able to deal much better with the incoming missiles and rockets that we're dealing with then. 2014, Hamas was already using attack tunnels, and we had to destroy over 30 attack tunnels. And it sounds almost like a bad joke today, because today we're looking at close to 500 miles of tunnels in the Gaza Strip. And in 2014, you had 30 or 32 of these attack tunnels coming into Israel. So we had to start dealing with that. And after that, Hamas began to also use incendiary balloons, which means they were flying over balloons with gas, and they were basically setting on fire a lot of the agricultural fields in Israel. And 2021, it was mostly missiles. And here you can see some of the statistics from each of these 4 what we call operations. And in terms of just the numbers over here, I think it's important to take a look at that the numbers that you see of Palestinians dying, okay, in these 4 conflicts are so much smaller than what you're seeing today. Okay, the dimensions are dramatically different on both sides of this, by the way, on both sides of this, but it's dramatically different. So those are operations. This is a real war. I think that probably all of you are familiar with the events of October 7th. So I want to emphasize a few things, which I think are important for us to keep in mind. First thing is October 7th, in no unstated terms, is absolutely a systemic Israeli failure that runs from the government through the defense establishment. Okay, the state and the defense establishment failed on October 7th. It failed the basic social contract that every country has with its people. Okay, basic security. It failed. Okay, and this is from the government through the ministry, through the defense establishment. Okay, this is very important. Now, that has to do with not only the surprise, but also the Israeli response. Because when you take a look at the response, it took the military way too long to get down there and to deal with the attacks on civilian communities. And the government itself, for weeks afterwards, not just 1, 2, 3, 4 days, was not functioning in terms of what do you do with the evacuated people? Okay, how do you have to you have tens of thousands. It started off with tens of thousands, and immediately Hezbollah began to shoot on communities in the north. So at the end of the day, we evacuated upwards of 120,000 people. But the folks in the Gaza envelope, the folks who were living in close proximity, who were under attack by Hamas, they weren't evacuated by the government. They were evacuated by civil society. People came down with the cars and brought them out of there, and people putting them up. I mean, it's ridiculous. The government failed. No, failed afterwards. The aftermath was also devastating and not so simple. So this is one point I think we have to take into account. It's very important. Okay, there was a systemic failure here. The second thing is, and as hard as to say, if we're honest with ourselves, on October 7th, Hamas won with a knockout. With a knockout. Okay, not only did they murder 1,200 people, but they took 240 some odd hostages, 95% of whom, upwards of that, were civilians, including elderly people, babies, what have you. This is I mean, a complete victory, and it's a victory on other levels, meaning that it shattered Israel's deterrence because immediately Hezbollah stepped in and began to shell us from the north of the country as well. So it shattered our deterrence, and we live in a very bad neighborhood, and we need to have deterrence. It undermined Israelis' personal security, sense of personal security, which has not been reinstated or retrieved till this very moment. I want to be very clear with you. It really undermined people's personal security. The acts themselves, and the atrocities themselves, which were systematic and deliberate, were designed very much for Israeli society in mind. In other words, burning people alive, if that seems to you something too similar to the Holocaust, it's not an accident. Okay, a lot of things there that were done very deliberately in order to ingrain a kind of a terror in Israeli society. Okay, and having a good deep understanding of the Jewish Israeli DNA, especially when you look back towards the Holocaust. This is not accidental in any way, shape, and form. I suspect that Hamas and Islam Jihad were more successful than they'd ever dreamed. They didn't think that Israel would be caught that much off guard. To a certain extent, overly successful. And in terms of Israel's response, it's very clear that we the government is going to get out and list the goals, okay, of this war, and the first two slots were to decapitate the Hamas's leadership, and the second one is is to completely degrade their offensive capabilities and ensure that they cannot attack us again. In third place, this initially, in third place was retrieving the hostages. Okay, and this is also something very problematic in terms of Israeli society. Okay, and part of the issue is that the three goals don't work together. Israel has the military power to decapitate Hamas and to totally degrade their offensive capabilities if we totally disregard the captives, the hostages. Just keep going and going till we kill all of them. But then all of our people are going to be killed there. Okay. And the opposite is also true. If we make a deal to get our hostages back, our captives back, it means that we're not going to be able to decapitate the Hamas leadership, and we're not going to be able to degrade their offensive capabilities to the extent that we need to do it. So the goals, the declared goals, are very contradictory. I think it is very important. If you do not know this, you should know. Okay, you should know very clearly that the United States, from day one of this conflict under the Biden administration, has supplied Israel almost with everything we've asked for, including huge quantities of very sophisticated weaponry in terms of shells. I'm talking about for our Air Force. I'm talking about stuff that was heading for Ukraine was routed towards Israel. We've gotten huge quantities of ammunition for everything we've requested, everything we need. And this is important because we are totally reliant on that supply chain. We're totally reliant. The fact the United States sent two aircraft carrier task forces and threatened the Iranians and Hezbollah to not to expand it bought Israel a lot of time. And this is very much appreciated by the Israeli people. And this is something that it doesn't matter where you stand in terms of your administration. I'm telling you how it's viewed from Israel in terms of what was done and what's being done up to this moment in a very complicated situation. Israelis, I'm just going to give you guys kind of a bottom line now for a moment, and then we'll open up to Q&A because I see the chat has there are already questions I think that have come in, and I want to give an opportunity to answer that. Look, a public opinion survey that took place about 5 days ago showed that 38% of Israelis are for rebuilding settlements in the heart of the Gaza Strip. 38%. That is actually a shockingly high percentage. That's number one. Number two, you're all aware of the fact that evidently negotiations are kicking in now in terms of releasing more hostages. We don't have all the details of the details that have been released 5 days ago. And again, the details are changing, right? But 51 or 52% of Israelis opposed the deal, whereas 38% or something like that were for it, and there was like 7 or 8%, whatever it was, that were undecided. And that is something that's very serious because the details are coming out that Israel would have to release maybe thousands of hardcore terrorists with blood on their hands, including people who we caught, okay, who murdered on October 7th. And we'd have to have a ceasefire that could turn into a permanent one. So you can see that over 50% of Israelis opposed that kind of a deal. But in the same token, one has to take into account that every single day, or as each day goes by, the chances of these hostages dying in captivity are rising dramatically. And the longer this takes, those who do survive the captivity are going to be so broken, I don't know if they're going to be reparable. And so this is a real national dilemma with only bad choices. And we haven't even gotten into the question of, being accused of genocide, how most of the world is perceiving Israel right now, how it's impacting Jews around the world, rising anti-Semitism. There is one thing that I think we do need to talk about, and this will be the last thing, and then I will really start taking the questions. Hezbollah has been attacking us from day one, and they have shot thousands of rockets into Israel in these last 3.5 to 4 months. We've killed about 200 of their operatives, and that's significant. That's about 10% of their elite Rajwan force. But Hezbollah has an insane arsenal facing Israel that Israel says is about 150,000 missiles, and the U.S. says 200,000. And if you can read what's in front of you, and I'll blow it up just so you get a better sense if it's too far away for you to see this. So take a look now when I kind of zoom in for you. Okay, you'll notice here that you've got missiles here that can go. Look at the distances here. Okay, and also on the right hand side. Okay, just in a sense where the border is. Okay, you see the border over here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. And you see where Jerusalem is over here. So basically, you're covering, okay, all the stuff you're seeing here is going to cover these first sets over here, which are, tens of thousands of rockets, cover a third of the country. You have several more tens of thousands of rockets that are covering everything, not just the north, okay? Starting from here, it's 160 kilometers. That means it hits Jerusalem, where I live. 210 kilometers is hitting. Basically, it's already getting to the south of the country. So essentially, they can hit all of Israel. And if you look at the warheads, 800 kilograms. If you want to know, the pound is just times 2.2. Okay. Well, 500 kilograms, these are very heavy payloads. And what's also important here, and I want to see if it's in over here. If they talk about the 1 second, the GPS, we're talking about stuff. Well, okay, maybe not. Basically, there's a question here of, and we don't know the answer to this, how many really truly accurate GPS guided projectiles and missiles do they hold? And this is something we don't know, but the sense is it's at least in the thousands, which means that if a second front opens, and the news in Israel today is that there's only a 30% chance of a diplomatic solution in the north. If a second front opens and it turns into a full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah, what we should expect, and believe me, I say there's no glee because I'll be in the receiving end on this personally with my family, we should expect thousands of Israeli citizens will be killed, that central infrastructure like ports, power stations, desalination plants will be hit, our airport, our international airport will be hit, and maybe some of the airfields, the Air Force airfields as well. We should also expect that Lebanon is going to be devastated, is going to be destroyed as a country. So this is a war that Israel would win, but it's going to take a very, very heavy price, and we might be edging in that direction. Israel and Hezbollah theoretically don't want this war, but mistakes have been made in the past, and mistakes can be made, and we can find ourselves sliding down a slippery slope into a very ugly and bad conflict, and which is going to make things even worse than they are right now. So let me just check out the questions that are coming in now, because you deserve to get some answers. You've heard enough of me. Okay, Al's asking, did King Abdullah offer to take Israel in as an autonomous province under Jewish control? So yeah, it's very interesting. Abdullah, who was a Hashemite king of Jordan in 48, and who had pretty good relations with Zionist leadership, met Golda Meir several times, met other Zionist leaders several times, he didn't want to see an autonomous Jewish, he didn't want to see a Jewish state, but he constantly, that he would give the Jews some semi-autonomy under the auspices of a Jordanian kingdom. So yeah, it is interesting. Yes, there was a kind of proposal like that, which obviously Israel was not interested in. Okay, Agnes is asking, can I comment on the possibility of changing the Palestinian refugee status? No, I think that the situation, it seems to be very comfortable for the Arab world to have the situation like as it is, and to a certain extent, from a political perspective, it's also comfortable for the Palestinians. I don't see that changing, and the UN is not exactly predisposed towards Israel at any point, but certainly not at this moment. Jordan's always seemed to be like the Arab power best situated to help broker a permanent peace. Is that a misconception? And if so, why? Okay. And why is Jordan seemingly uninvolved in the process? So Jordan is actually a very interesting country because it's a very complicated one. Something like 80% of the population of Jordan are ethnic Palestinians, but their leadership are Bedouin. Hashemites are Bedouin. They don't even come from Jordan. They come from what today is Saudi Arabia. There are tensions between the Palestinian majority and the Bedouin minority. Remind you that in Black September 1970, there was an attempted Palestinian coup d'etat against the Hashemite regime. And to complicate things a little bit more, the Hashemites are the Islamic patrons of the Haram Sharif, of the noble sanctuary on the Temple Mount. That's very important to them because the Hashemites trace their ancestry to the Prophet Muhammad, and they had been the patrons of the two holy sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. They lost it to the Saudis. The Saudis are a different Bedouin tribe that basically deposed the Hashemites. So the Hashemites, the fact that they are the Islamic patrons on the third holy site is very important in terms of their religious/political legitimacy. And therefore, on the one hand, every time there are tensions between Israel and the Palestinians, the Jordanians always take the Palestinian side because they're the patrons of this Islamic site. The flip side of that is that Israel has for a long time been a very important strategic asset for Jordan, and Jordan's been a very important strategic asset for Israel. And just to show you how far that goes, in 1970, we intervened on behalf of Jordan. When the Syrians began to invade Jordan, we did not allow the Syrians to continue, and this bought King Hussein of Jordan enough time to actually defeat the attempted coup. That's 1970. In 2014, when ISIS reared its ugly head, I'll remind you that you had an American-made coalition that was fighting ISIS, and a Jordanian fighter pilot was shot down. And on YouTube, ISIS burned him alive. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. It's not that long ago. It's a decade. It's a decade ago, a little less than a decade ago, 2014. And as ISIS was getting closer and closer to the Jordanian frontier, Israel and the United States, by the way, but Israel publicly stated that they would come to Jordan's aid militarily if they were attacked by ISIS. That's quite incredible. Okay, Jordan has sometimes been a mitigating, a calming voice for the Palestinians, but the kingdom itself is always sitting on the edge, and they always have to take the Palestinians, their Palestinian majority population, into account. And that Palestinian majority population is very hostile to Israel. So it's very, very complicated. And therefore, Jordan is not really that active in participating in the peace processes, which are not happening anyway since 2014. Could land swaps be part of the two-state solution to create a contiguous Palestinian state? Look, this is a question from Doris. Let me make something unequivocally clear. Even though you're hearing all the time the three words two-state solution, you have to take into account that at this very moment, less than 30% of the Israelis and Palestinians are for a two-state solution. In December of 2022, which was a little over a year ago, a joint Israeli-Palestinian poll showed that something like 45% of Israelis and 45% of Palestinians were for two-state solutions. There wasn't even over 50% majority in December 22. And the truth is that there was a majority for it in the in the 90s, and let's say in the first decade or the first decade of the 21st century. Starting from 2018, at the very least, there has been less than 50% on both sides for a two-state solution. And today you're at a point where you're less than a third on both sides that are for a two-state solution. The world can't want the solution more than the players themselves. Is it possible to impose a two-state solution? Maybe. But that would entail a lot of political will on those who are imposing. I'll say that again. You could impose both on Israel and the Palestinians a two-state solution, but the imposer, okay, would have to have a lot of political will to follow through on that. And certainly at this juncture right now, you're not going to find anybody like that because, for example, the United States is an election year now. So that would not be something that would happen. I can imagine happening right now in terms of imposing. Also, please keep in mind that you have a very, very weak leadership on the Palestinian side. And on the Israeli side, the present Israeli government, which calls itself, I'll loosely translate from Hebrew, a hardcore right-wing government. They call themselves Memshelet Yamin al-Maleh. And that al-Maleh is kind of a slang for saying we're a full course right-wing government. And in this full course right-wing government, you have, I don't know, a third to a half of the coalition are unequivocally opposed to a two-state solution forever, from day one, not just this juncture. Okay, and so the Israeli government, as is, as in its present constitution, I don't see any way it's going to go for it as it stands right now. It may not stand this way forever, and governments don't stand forever. But that's I think it's important for you to understand that. Linda's asking, are Hezbollah mainly Shiites? Hezbollah are only Shiites. Okay, so Linda doesn't understand how the declared goals are contradictory. If we get the hostages back and then take out Hamas later, what's the rush? Okay, so basically, if we get the hostages back and we're agreeing through international mediation that we are going to have a ceasefire, we can't break that ceasefire with ease. Okay, the guarantors of this are the United States, our most important ally, and other European allies of ours. We need the mediators, we need allies, and we cannot, once we go to the deal, it'd be very difficult for us to then do it later. It doesn't quite work that way. By the way, it would certainly, in the event that we cut a deal and got the hostages back now, and Hamas is still in charge there, and they still have some of their offensive inventory, and they certainly have. At this point, we believe that we have killed a little over 50% of the Hamas terrorists, and we've injured another, I don't know, 2 or 3,000, but there's still several thousands of them who are still fighting and still armed. And so we have not to this point degraded their offensive capabilities to the extent that needs to be done. We haven't even gotten to any of their leadership, so we haven't decapitated leadership at all. And getting the hostage back right now would preclude and basically fly in the face of the other two goals. Al's asking, is the Mossad facing any reform pressure since October 7th? Oh, it's very interesting, Al, because Mossad is the wrong address. The right address is the Shin Bet. Okay, the Mossad doesn't deal. The Mossad is not the organization that would be dealing with Hamas. And what would be happening on the Israeli Gaza border. The Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service, is the one that was in charge of that and took responsibility. It has to be said that after October 7th, the chief of staff of the IDF, the head of the Southern Command, the head of military intelligence, and the head of the Shin Bet, all of them took personal responsibility for the failure and made it clear that when the war is over, they're resigning. The government hasn't done that, has not taken any responsibility. And the prime minister, in fact, last week said he's not responsible at all for it. He said it unequivocally last week. Okay. Okay, Susan, I'm trying to understand Susan's questions here. Iran loyalty to the Shiite Hezbollah. Iran probably not as loyal to Hamas. Sunni. I don't know what kite runner means. What is my opinion? Okay, look, I'll say it again. Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran's. It's an Iranian creation, and they're beholden to Iran. And they're Shiites, both of them, both Hezbollah and Iran. Hamas was not created by Iran. Hamas is Sunni, but they have received funding and weaponry from Iran as a convenience. And clearly their connection or their alliance is something that it's of convenience and it's temporary. Okay, because one is Shiite, the other one is Sunni, for sure. And in fact, Iran did not do what Hamas was hoping, expecting. They didn't unleash Hezbollah with all of its force against Israel, and Iran also didn't attack Israel. So Hamas has actually expressed its disappointment in Iran. Okay, so okay. Jim is saying if Israel is almost 100% reliant on U.S. military supplies and these conflicts seem to have no end, why shouldn't the U.S. pull out? It seems there is no end. So Jim, it's a very good question. So first of all, Israel's not 100% reliant on the United States, but for the more sophisticated stuff, in the last decade, we have been. Before that, we weren't, but in the last decade, we have been. The United States began under President Obama, and it continued under President Trump to try to pivot to a different region of the world that appeared to be more important, which was the Asian rim, and specifically China rising. And it became clear at some point that you may want to pivot, but the Middle East is not willing to let you pivot so quickly. And the reality on the ground is that if you take a look at the macro picture over here, we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but there are other players here that are getting involved in the international arena. And Iran, in the last year and a half, has managed to get squarely in bed with Russia. They're supplying the Russians with a lot of the drones, a lot of things that Russia's using against Ukraine, which is completely against U.S. national interests. And China is now also being supportive of Iran. In other words, there appears to be an axis of rivals / enemies of the United States that are involved on the other side of this conflict. The United States is interested in moderate regimes and stable and pro-American regimes here, starting with number one, Israel, which has always been pro-American and is stable, but continuing on to the Saudi Arabians and Egyptians and others in this region that are facing, these are Sunni regimes that are facing Shiite Iran and its proxies. If you take a look at what the Houthis are doing, okay, they are basically tampering with international maritime trade. And it's not just a question of how it harms Israel, it's harming trade globally. So the United States and UK have gotten involved in that as well. So it's not just about Israel. The United States has larger interests. Iran, remember, Iran didn't capture the American embassy and hold people hostage for over 400 days because of Israel. It had nothing to do with Israel. Okay, Iran has been messing with the United States since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and has threatened American interests in this region. So it's not just about that. And so the United States, by the way, one of the things that we can say about the U.S.-Israeli alliance is that Israel has never asked, till this moment, has never asked the United States for Americans to die for Israel, to have U.S. soldiers with boots on the ground. Never, ever, ever. Okay, we're doing our own fighting. We're just saying, supply us with what we need. In terms of, these conflicts never seem to end. Look, Jim, if you were in the last session, I opened up with saying that the conflict itself has not been going on for millennia, and it hasn't been going on for hundreds of years. This conflict has been going on for slightly more than 100 years, okay, with different levels of intensity. Ireland went for several hundreds of years. I can look at other conflicts that have been going on for much, much longer time. And at least it seems on paper right now that Ireland seems to be quiet, and it seems they seem to have some kind of peaceful resolution over there. The fact that conflicts are long going doesn't mean the attempt should not be made to find some kind of peaceful solution. Yeah, in terms of what do we have over here? I got a last question because I have to go on to my next. I have another session I'm heading to very soon. Okay, so because I'm going to another session very soon, I'm just going to ask one last question, which is kind of a basic one, which I think is important. Eileen's asking, can I explain the difference between Shiites and Sunnis? So basically, the first big schism that took place in Islam took place right after the Prophet Muhammad died. He dies in 632 CE or AD, and the schism ran along the question of who will be the successor of Muhammad as the leader of the Islamic nation. And it broke down to two schools of thought. One school of thought said, by the way, I have to say that he didn't have any male offspring. Okay, so one school of thought that it should be that person who embodies the best leadership characteristics, the most righteous person, the smartest person, the best military commander. And that school of thought is known as Sunnah, or plural, Sunni. The other school of thought said, listen, while it's true that Muhammad did not have male offspring, he had female offspring. They got married, and they bore male grandchildren. And therefore, it should be in his direct lineage. And they're known as Shia or Shiites. And they're going to be duking it out for decades. And there's a final cataclysmic battle that takes place in what today is Iraq, in a place called Karbala, where Sunni forces decimate Shiite forces, and there's no love lost between these two. There are some theological differences between them. For example, the Shiites believe in a kind of a messianic figure, but the bottom line is they're not that different theologically. There are some differences. If the 85% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni, 15% are Shiite. Historically, Shiites have been persecuted when they've lived in a majority Sunni regimes, especially coming into the modern era. So there's really no love lost between Sunnis and Shiites. And look, we've seen what's played out in Iraq and in Syria, even internally to a certain extent in Iran. And this is something that is been with Islam for a very, very long time. Thank you for joining us. Tried to get as much as I could in the session. Like I said, I have something different subject, not this conflict, not these players that's coming up in a few minutes. So I have to change my physical venue and change my mindset. Thank you for joining us for this, and I hope you'll join future programming. Kate?
Thank you, Avi. We are so grateful for your expertise in these last couple of Sundays together. You have heard that we are fortunate enough to host Avi in town. He is having public events tomorrow evening, February 5th at Rodef Shalom, and another on February 7th at Temple Emmanuel. You can use the link that I just dropped in the chat to register for either of those if you care to. Lastly, we are grateful as ever for you to join us today, and donations are gratefully accepted at the link I just dropped into the chat, and I see that I invited Avi privately to his own event, and so let me add that for everybody there. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Stay well, stay warm. Thank you, Avi.